welcome to the award-winning Thoughts from a Page podcast, a member of the Evergreen Podcasts Network, hosted by me, Cindy Burnett, a voracious reader and book columnist who provides you with casual author conversations and book recommendation episodes, as well as insider information on all of the newest releases that I personally endorse and on the publishing industry in my behind-the-scenes series. With so many books coming out weekly, it can be hard to decide what to read, so I find the best ones and share them with you. For more book recommendations or to find my backlist of interviews, visit my website at thoughtsfromapage.com. Have you read a book recently that really resonated with you and makes you want to read a book more like it? If so, submit a read-alike request to me through my Google form located in today's show notes and tell me why you loved it, and I will suggest some similar reads on a future Tuesday episode. If you're interested in reading some great books before they publish, I hope you will consider joining my Patreon group to access additional content, including early reads and pre-pub author chats and bonus episodes. I just added Banyan Moon by Tao Tai for May and The Bones of the Story by Carol Goodman for June. The link to join is in the show notes. Today, Elly Griffiths returns to chat with me about The Last Remains. Elly is the USA Today best-selling author of the Ruth Galloway and Brighton Mystery Series and the standalone novels The Stranger Diaries, The Postscript Murders, and Bleeding Heart Yard. She is a recipient of the Edgar Award for the Best Novel, the Mary Higgins Clark Award, and the CWA Dagger in the Library Award. She lives in Brighton, England. I hope you enjoy our conversation. And now for a quick break. For the last year, I have been focusing more on my health and eating habits. In connection with that, I have started drinking AG1 in the morning. When I started drinking AG1 daily, I could feel a real difference in my health and energy levels. That is because AG1 is a foundational nutrition supplement that supports your body's universal needs like gut optimization, stress management, and immune support. Since 2010, AG1 has led the future of foundational nutrition, continuously refining their formula to create a smarter, better way to elevate your baseline health. I recommend AG1 to all of my family and friends because the company has a team of doctors and scientists. It is tested for 950 contaminants and is NSF certified for sport. It is formulated based on the latest science, and it maintains high quality standards. Thanks AG1 for sponsoring my show. AG1 is a supplement I trust to provide the support my body needs daily. If you want to take ownership of your health, it starts with AG1. Try AG1 and get a free 1-year supply of vitamin D3K2 and 5 free AG1 travel packs with your first purchase. Go to drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. That's drinkag1.com/thoughtsfromapage. Check it out. And now back to my show. Welcome, Elly. How are you today?
I'm really well, thank you, Cindy. It's great to be here.
I am so glad you're back. I love the Ruth Galloway series, and we talked a little bit about it when we were talking about your last book, but I'm glad you're here today to talk about it.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad to be here. Yes, it's not long before The Last Remains is out in the US, so I'm really excited about that.
Well, before we start chatting about The Last Remains, let's talk about the series generally and how this is the last one, at least for now.
Yes, I'm saying the last for now. I must admit I'm keeping a few of my options open. But yes, so the Ruth Galloway series is about a forensic archaeologist called Dr. Ruth Galloway, and she lives on her own or on her own with her cats at the beginning of the series on a beautiful but rather desolate bit of the North Norfolk coast, which is on the eastern side of Great Britain. It's a very beautiful place, but a very full of history, very full of folklore and folk memory, but also, it can be quite sort of desolate at certain times of the year. So in the first book, which is called The Crossing Places, Ruth is called in by the police because they've found bones on the marshland. And Ruth sees the bones and knows almost immediately that they're actually over 2,000 years old. But she's drawn into the case and into a very complicated relationship with the police officer, who's called DCI Harry Nelson. So The Last Remains is book 15, and almost 15 years have passed. I've written one a year for 15 years. And now we're going to see, I think, where that relationship ends up in a way. It's not the end of the whole thing, probably, but it's certainly the end of this chapter in Ruth's life.
I like that, this chapter in Ruth's life.
Yeah, yes. It's quite fitting, isn't it?
It is. I've been reading them since the beginning, and I didn't really think about there had been one a year. That's quite a pace because, as we talked last time, you're also writing other books in between.
Well, I I didn't really think about it. It sounds silly to say that really, but I was thinking the other day that, yes, I've written one a year for 15 years. So I've written through my kids growing up and going away to university. I've written through my mum getting ill and dying. I've written through COVID and lockdown and all the other sort of smaller joys and sorrows of the last 15 years. So really, Ruth has been my constant companion. And you're right to say as well, I've written other books because the last few years I've been writing 2 a year. So I've got a series that are called The Brighton Mysteries now, which are set in the 1950s and 60s in the theatrical world. And I've written some standalones as well, Stranger Diaries, Postscript Murders, and more recently, Bleeding Heart Yard. So, yeah, quite a few books in the last few years.
That's pretty impressive.
Well, I don't know. It feels odd to sort of think about it in that way, doesn't it, really? But it's been a real privilege, I have to say that, because not many people, not many writers get the chance to write their dream series. And certainly when I started these books, when I started with The Crossing Places, I didn't know that it would be a series. I knew there was a series there, if that makes sense. I knew that Ruth was a character who kind of could sustain a series. And I also knew her relationship with Nelson would be a long-running one. But I didn't know that I'd get a chance to write it, really. And so few writers do get a chance to write that many books. So I have to say, I feel very lucky.
Well, that was going to be one of my questions. When you started out, did you ever dream that you'd be 15 books in?
No, not at all, because I'd written 4 books before, and they were under my real name, which you know, Cindy, is Domenica De Rosa. So I wrote these, I guess they were kind of romances, women's fiction under my real name. And when I wrote The Crossing Places, my then publishers didn't want it. So I didn't think it would get published at all. But then, luckily, there was another publisher, Quercus Books, and a wonderful editor, Jane Wood, who did want it. But, then I thought, and then I had to have a new name. So my agent said to me, maybe you could sell the book if you had a more crimey name. So I came up with Elly Griffiths, which was actually my grandmother's name. She was Ellen Griffiths. But I thought I'd only be Elly for that one book. Now I think there are 28 Elly Griffiths books, which seems amazing. So absolutely not. I thought I would be lucky to write one in this series, maybe 2, with a bit of a following wind, 3 or 4, but certainly not this many.
I love that you mentioned the pseudonym again, because we talked about that last time and I didn't know that. And I usually do know it. And I was like, but it is interesting that the name that you chose as your pseudonym, first of all, that it was your grandmother's. I love that. But second, that's the name you're writing under all the time now.
Yes. And it's so funny, isn't it? Because I think if you were to see, and I think we chatted about this last time, if you were to see Domenica De Rosa and Elly Griffiths, I think you'd assume that Domenica De Rosa was the pseudonym. But of course, it's my real name. It's Italian. My dad was Italian. So having that sort of exotic name like that, I must admit, it probably did influence my decision to be a writer. I thought I had a writery name. So it feels quite strange, but also a bit liberating, really, to be better known under this other, more kind of prosaic name, but still a great name. And as I said, still a family name. It was my grandmother's name. So my ancestry is half Italian, half Welsh. And I think I said this before, I should be able to sing, but I can't.
I do think it's funny because your real name does sound like it would be the pseudonym.
Yes, it really does. And I think people are kind of surprised by it when I come up with it. And it's just a name that does sound a bit made up, but it is my real name. And I think the thinking as well was that Domenica De Rosa is a very romantic name, and my first 4 books were quite romantic. So I think it was felt that it wasn't quite hard-edged and crimey enough. So Elly Griffiths is my crime name.
Was it grim enough? It sounded too happy.
I think so. It sounded a bit too happy, sounded too Italianate maybe. And I think maybe at the time there might have been in the UK and here fewer writers writing with European names. Now maybe it's a little bit different. Names that weren't British sounding. But yeah, so it's been a while since I've written anything other than Elly Griffiths, really.
I think that's just fascinating to think about.
I think it is interesting, but I do remember somebody saying that they thought that writers whose names began FGH sold more. So because it's on eye level in the shops, A's at the top, Z's down below, FGH is sort of on eye level. So I don't know how true that is, but there we are. There's another reason for being Elly Griffiths.
Exactly. Well, how did you settle on Norfolk originally?
Well, what it was I was on holiday in Norfolk with my husband, Andy, who's an archaeologist, when I had the idea for the series. And we were kind of walking along this beautiful bit of Norfolk coastline, and it's kind of marshy. There's marshland, there's sand dunes, and there's sea. And Andy happened to say that prehistoric people had thought marshland was sacred because it's neither land nor sea, but something in between, kind of liminal zone, if you like. That's why prehistoric people sometimes buried bodies there, because they thought it was a link to the afterlife. Neither land nor sea, neither life nor death. So it was that sort of bridging place, that sort of in-between place. So that gave me the idea for the first Ruth book. And I realized immediately that she would have to be an archaeologist. And I suppose then it was just the really natural choice to make her live in Norfolk, because Norfolk is full of archaeology. It really genuinely is full of bodies because it's been inhabited for so long. I think the earliest human footprints outside Africa are found in Norfolk, on the Norfolk coast there, Haysborough. Of course, it wasn't a sea coast then, it was a river coast. But it really has been inhabited for a long time. So there's loads of archaeology, there are loads of stories, there's loads of mythology. Also, my grandmother, the first Elly Griffiths, lived in Norfolk, and my aunt lived there for a long time. So I used to spend holidays there as a child, and I was really fond of the area. And my Aunt Marge, who is credited in the first book, in The Crossing Places, was great at telling these kind of Norfolk ghost stories, a lot of which have found their way into the book. So it really did just seem the perfect setting for a series of books, really.
I always enjoy series that are set someplace unique, and I think that's what drew me into your series originally. And then I worked at Murder by the Book for a while, and it was such a hugely popular series there, and I was always selling it, and I would hear that over and over again. I love the setting.
That's so lovely, and Murder by the Book have been so supportive always. There's a few sort of bookshops in the US that have been so supportive from the beginning. Yes, I like that too about a series. If you're in Donna Leon's Venice or Colin Dexter's Oxford or something, I do like the idea of finding out about a new place as well as finding out who did it, really. It is I think crime fiction as well, quite often is very much about the landscape and the place, isn't it? Maybe buried memories that come with the terrain. So I think landscape and setting is really important in crime fiction.
I think that's exactly right, because we often talk about how history bubbles up to the surface all the time and the past bubbles up. And so I think that's definitely a theme in your books.
Oh, great. Well, I'd very much like to think so. Yes. And I think there is that sort of sense that maybe the landscape itself is important, that comes from that very beginning bit about the marshland being a sacred place. I think sometimes the setting itself is almost a character, isn't it, in crime fiction? If you think of the shifting and the shivering sands in Wilkie Collins' A Moonstone, which I must admit is one of my favourite books, it's that sense that the place itself is almost a character. I love that.
I love that too. Well, do you have a favorite in the series? You talk about how long you've been writing it and the various things that have happened during those 15 years. Is there any particular story that you look back on and think, I loved that time period, or I liked what was happening when I was writing, or this was an ode to something? Is there any one particular book that really sticks out to you?
Oh, that's a really great way of putting it, actually. I have to say, I often feel fondest of the most recent one. And I do feel particularly fond of The Last Remains because it does tie up some loose ends, in a way, some loose ends between Ruth and Nelson, but also some loose ends from earlier on in the series, so that I know have been waiting there ready to be tied up. So I think that one is always going to be a favourite. I have a real soft spot for The Ghost Fields, which is kind of in the middle. I think it's a book 7, and it's about a Second World War plane being found in Norfolk, and about those old airfields that during the Second World War, there were these American airfields in Norfolk, and now they're fallen into disrepair, or some of them are farmland, and they're called the Ghost Fields. And I have a particular fondness for that one, I think, because it ends up with all the characters marooned together in a stately home. And I just love that. I love that trope, which you often find in crime fiction, of people being sort of stuck in a house miles away from anywhere. But it's hard to pull it off naturally, really. But I think what happened was, in this particular period, there were terrible floods, which of course was an awful thing. But there were genuinely these terrible floods in Norfolk. So it meant I could make them be sort of marooned in this house in the middle of nowhere. So that one is a particular favourite of mine. I also really like The Dark Angel, which is set in Italy, because it's based in a place where we have a little house in Italy. I've called it Castello degli Angeli in the book, but the real place is called Fontana Liri Superiore. So I did like writing about that.
Yes, a personal connection.
Yes, definitely. And it's not often that you get to write about a place that you personally know so well. And also it was very nice to give Ruth a bit of a break, actually. It was the first time she went away on holiday. So, in 15 books, she's only had one holiday abroad, and that's the one in The Dark Angel.
And then stuff still happens.
Unfortunately for her, it's still a crime novel. So yeah, stuff still happens.
Exactly. Well, let's talk about The Last Remains. Can you give me a quick synopsis now, and then we'll dive into some of my questions?
Yes, so The Last Remains starts when a skeleton is found behind the wall of a cafe in King's Lynn in Norfolk. Again, Ruth's called in, a bit of an echo back to the first book. And this time she only has to look at the bones to know that they're relatively modern, partly because there's a steel plate in the foot. So she knows that the bones are relatively modern. And they turn out to be those of a Cambridge student, an archaeology student called Emily, who went missing 20 years ago. And it's a very personal case for Ruth, because not only is it the same Cambridge College where she taught, the girl was a friend of Ruth's great friend, Cathbad. So the story goes back to Cathbad and to a group of archaeologists and archaeology students who used to meet at a place called Grimes Graves, which is a Neolithic flint mine in Norfolk, and a very spooky, wonderful setting, I have to say. So all roads seem to lead back to the flint mine. So that's really the setting and the start of The Last Remains.
Was it hard to craft this one in particular, knowing it was going to be the end for the characters, or had you been plotting and thinking about it for a while?
It was quite hard because I had set myself a few tasks that I had to do. Not only had I said to readers who followed Ruth and Nelson's sort of will they, won't they story, that in this book you would find out whether they did or they didn't. So I knew I had to deliver on that. Also, as I said, there were a few loose ends from earlier books that I wanted to really tie up. But also I'd sort of set myself a bit of a task, like a secret challenge, of kind of mentioning every one of the previous 15 books in this book and tying them into the story. So any readers who have followed me on the way, and I should just say as well, if you haven't read any of the books, you can start here. All the books are completely sort of self-sufficient and you can read them as standalones. But if you have read all the previous books, there's a little something from all of them in this book. So it was quite hard to achieve that. I had a little chart written down. And when I mentioned something in the previous book, I was like, oh, tick that one off, I've done that. So there were a few challenges, but also did make it a lot of fun to write, I have to say.
I wish you'd included that at the back so that I could make sure I had ticked them off myself.
Maybe I should post it on my Facebook page or something. That's a really good idea. I should have done that.
Oh, that's a great idea to either put it on your website or Facebook or Instagram somewhere. I love that because I would love to go back and make sure I picked them all up.
And I love that, don't you, when books give you something like that to do. I read a wonderful murder mystery at Christmas by Alexandra Benedict, and she had all these quiz questions that were mentioned in the book. And at the end, she gave you the answers, which was so great.
Exactly. You're like, just in case I missed it, somebody does give me the key here.
Yes.
No spoilers here, but I loved the way you handled the ending. You wrapped up, obviously, the topic you mentioned a little bit ago, Ruth and Nelson, and what was going to happen with them. But you also wrapped in something else, and that was such a wonderful surprise.
Oh, I'm so glad. I have to say that particular bit of the plot was something I really wanted to do. And I did think in the end that it did work. You know, you're always a little bit worried when you write a book, of course. And when it comes out, you think, oh, you know, have I done what I set out to achieve? But I did feel pleased. I do like it when things are tied up neatly, not too neatly, but in a believable way. So I do hope I did that. So there were a few things like that I did feel were achieved. And, you know, I did hope that all worked really in terms of the plot.
I thought it worked quite well. And now everybody's going to be dying to read the book so they can know what we're talking about.
Oh, thank you. I do hope so. Thank you.
Well, I saw in the back in the acknowledgments that 2 people won contests to have their names included in this one. I think that's so much fun when that happens. Can we talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Well, for the last few books, I've offered a prize for people who enter a charity auction for a charity that's really close to my heart for teenage cancer sufferers. And the prize is to have your name mentioned in one of my books. And it's always a bit of a challenge to include the character in the books. And I don't know whether other authors feel like this, but I always feel I have to say I can't make them the murderer or the victim. But also you want to make them a pretty significant character. So there's always quite a challenge. And I usually ask the person, is there anything you want to go in, like any hobbies you have? And this particular character in this book runs marathons. So she goes in the book and I think I say something like, she runs marathons, but Ruth still likes her. So I just wanted to have a few little sort of pointers to the real character's interests. And this time I also wanted to include a local Norfolk charity, which is a Norfolk hospice. And so, in fact, I think it's the chairperson of the hospice won the auction. So he's gone in the books as well, and he's become the Chancellor of Ruth's University, which is quite an important role in this book because Ruth's job is under threat, which it's happening a lot in British universities, that departments like archaeology that maybe can't be measured exactly in terms of money, they're under threat of being closed, which is so shocking, I think, because of all the amazing knowledge and expertise that is tied up in an archaeology department. To close it just seems terrible, but that is the threat that's hanging over Ruth in this book.
I think that's happening here as well, not necessarily with archaeology, but I know I have a friend whose son does musical theater, and he had applied to a variety of colleges, went to USC where the program's doing beautifully, but 2 of the schools he applied to have shut down their program. So she was so glad he hadn't gone there. So I definitely think that's something that's happening a variety of places as they're worrying about cost cutting. But it's such a shame.
Such a shame. It seems so short-sighted. I mean, there's quite a push here in the UK. The current government wants people, say, to study maths, or math, she says, in a bilingual way, up to 18. And of course, maths is really important. But I think it's really short-sighted to turn your back on the arts. And, I'd love to see people continue to do music. My son is a musician. And it's very hard to be a musician without sort of having some sort of private lessons and private funding, because it's just not taught in a lot of state schools. So I'd love to see the arts get some attention as well.
I agree. And we can't all study math. I mean, there's only so many roads you can take with a math degree. And I mean, I studied math. I love math. But I don't think everybody should study math. I think you have to have a wide range of people studying different things and going into different careers. How boring would it be, and limiting?
Yes, exactly. And it's so, I feel it makes a richer society. And a subject like archaeology as well, that maybe you don't earn a lot of money when you're an archaeologist. I know that Andy always says that they employ archaeologists on building sites when they have a new build, because the archaeologist has to see if there were any sort of archaeology there in the ground, particularly in a country like Britain that's so lived in for so long. There might well be something Roman there in the foundations. But Andy always says the archaeologist is the lowest paid person on site, always. When you think of how much training they've had, but it's not about the money, is it? It's about other things. And it's not necessarily the jobs that generate money or make money. They're not always the ones that are most worth doing. So I think there were other measures. I think that's true.
And back to people winning contests to be in a book. That would be so much fun. I need to do more investigating, because I would love to be in a book as a character sometime.
I'm never sure whether I would or not. But yes, and I suppose also because my real name is so noticeable, I think it would be quite difficult to slip a Domenica de Rosa into a book. Maybe it wouldn't. I don't know. But I know that people do seem very, very happy to have it. And a few people have become recurring characters. So Jan Adams, who's the police dog handler in my books, started off as a competition winner. And actually, I've since met Jan and her lovely husband and their lovely dog. So now they've kind of become friends, and they're still appearing in the book. So that's very nice.
That is very nice. But how fun. And I can see what you're saying, that your name is distinctive enough. And then if you went with Elly Griffiths, everybody would be like, well, I know her as well. But still, just that idea that you're showing up in print. And I can see why people would think that was fun.
It is fun. And in fact, the writer, Peter James, is a very well-known writer here, particularly in Brighton. He did include me and fellow Brighton writer William Shaw in one of his books, which was very sweet. It was a character saying, oh, my favourite writers are Elly Griffiths and William Shaw, which was very sweet of him.
I always enjoy when I see that. So what surprised you the most when writing this one?
What surprised me the most? Well, one of the big surprises was Grimes Graves, which is the Neolithic flint mining complex that I went to in the course of researching the book. And you can visit them. And I really do absolutely urge anyone to visit them if they can. Because these incredible mine shafts, which are something like 12 meters down into the ground, which of course were excavated just by using antler picks and bones of animals. And then these incredible mine shafts where they go right down to the earth and they would mine the flint from there. And that was a big surprise to me, just to go down there and to see this network of tunnels. And I'm not so good at going underground. I was a bit worried about going. And we climbed down this tunnel. I was very lucky because Andy and I got a private tour. So they took us down some of the mine shafts that aren't open to the public. And this great guy called Tim took us down. And at the bottom of the tunnel, at the bottom of the mine shaft, you saw these little tunnels. And I thought, thank goodness we don't have to go in there. And then Tim said, so we're just going to crawl into the smallest tunnel. And I thought, oh no. But actually it was really, really interesting. And so interesting that I forgot to be scared, really. But they do create quite a scary scene in the book. So that was quite a surprise, I have to say, and a wonderful one.
Do you have anything on your website where you have Ruth's various events that have happened or the crimes or things like that so that if somebody came to Norfolk, they could do a Ruth Galloway tour?
No, I don't, but there's going to be a book called Ruth Galloway's Norfolk, which is out in the UK later on this year, I think in November. And it does do exactly that. So it follows Ruth's journey from the crossing places to the last remains. And it's all the amazing places in Norfolk. So you've got Roman remains, you've got Civil War remains, Victorian remains, you've got these amazing tunnels underneath Norwich. So all those will come into the book. So I will put something obviously about that onto my website, but hopefully it will be available in the States soon too.
Well, that's even better. I just think it would be so fun if I came to Norfolk to be able to visit all the places I've read about. So I love that you're doing it as a book.
I have to say, it's a little ambition of mine to have the Ruth Galloway trail through Norfolk. And some people just do it, on their own bat. And recently over the Easter weekend here in Britain, a few people on Twitter have been sharing pictures where they have followed Ruth's journey. And it's been wonderful to see them, so to Walsingham, to the shrine at Walsingham and the beach and Cromer Pier and all those things. So I have to admit the Ruth Galloway trail is a goal for me one day.
That would be very cool.
It really would.
So what's up next for you? This Ruth book that has everywhere she has been, but what else?
So the next thing I'm going to do is another book in the Brighton Mystery series, which is going to be called The Great Deceiver. And then there's another book in the series. It's not quite a series, but there's a group of kind of linked books that feature D.I. Hobbin de Cour, who first appears in The Stranger Diaries. So the next book about her is going to be called The Last Word, and it's about an obituary writer. Very hard word to say, obituary, but hard for me anyhow. And then there's going to be a new series. So there's going to be a new series. I can't say very much more about it because I'm only just, coming up with the ideas for it. But I've got some ideas for a new series. And as I say, you never know, there might well be another Ruth book one day.
I was wondering if you were going to start a new series.
Well, it's just that you have all these ideas, don't you? And though it's wonderful to follow the same character for 15 years, there's a time when you want to write something different. And for me, this felt very much like I needed a pause, not just in Ruth's story, but kind of in my own story. I need a bit of a pause to think of some new things and to have some new challenges. So that's kind of where I am now.
Go in a different direction.
Yeah, yes. And just do some new things and come up with a new cast of characters. I must admit, it's very exciting to start peopling your world with different people.
And do you think when you do that this time, you will really think hard, okay, I'm starting a new series, and I need to not write myself into a corner? I mean, I wonder, I haven't ever noticed that in your books, but when you started these Ruth Galloways, you weren't maybe thinking, okay, I'm going to be writing 15 books. So there may be times when you look back and think, oh, I wish I hadn't done that, or I wish I hadn't said she did this. Will you think more about that, or will you just write and figure it's all going to work out like it did with Ruth?
I will try and think a bit about that. You're so right. I mean, one little thing, but it turned out to be quite an annoying thing. Was this in the first book in Crossing Places? I said that Ruth never wore jeans. And I don't know why I said that, because I live in jeans. And it was so frustrating because so many times you want to say, just sort of shorthand for saying she wasn't dressed smartly or she was dressed casually. And so she was just in jeans. So I've got to say by about book 8, she's wearing jeans. So I'm going to try not to do anything like that. But, it's so funny, isn't it? Because you set yourself, think, I must think about a character in a way that will last for a whole series, but I'm sure I will come up with characters who are, who have their own difficulties and problems in them, because you just can't be sure who's going to pop up in your mind. For example, I didn't really expect Cathbad, the Druid, in book 1 to now be a really strong character still in book 15. And I didn't know anything about Druids at the beginning, really, and I've had to learn quite a bit, but I'm sure there'll be something like that, a character who's meant to be a minor character who will suddenly start taking over. But that's quite fun too, isn't it, when you start to see that, when you start to see a character writing their own story in a way.
Absolutely. And I think, like you said, I mean, you're like, I have no idea why I said she doesn't wear jeans, but it's easy to remedy that. So it's one of those things that you can just correct it, or you can do a workaround, whatever it's going to be. But I think it's just fascinating to think, okay, I'm writing a standalone. I don't really have to worry about anything that's happening again, versus I'm writing a series and am I going to hobble myself by doing something or another?
And you don't always know, do you? I remember in the first book, that I thought would be a standalone, The Stranger Diaries. So there's a detective called Harbinder Kaur in that. And I remember the fantastic Scottish crime writer Val McDermott was so kind because she read a proof and was very lovely about the book. And she said, when's the next book about Harbinder? And I said, oh, no, there isn't going to be another one. It's just a standalone. And she said in her lovely Scottish accent, which I'm not going to attempt to do, she said, oh, no, she's got more stories to tell. And so sometimes those characters do come up, don't they, where sometimes you've got a great character that's still a good character, but they're only going to be there for one book. You can't imagine them being there longer. But some characters kind of keep on at you, don't they, until you end up writing more about them. So I think that hopefully there'll be a few of those as well.
And I think they're saying, okay, I still have stories to tell here. Don't leave me. This isn't the only book that I want to be in.
Yes, definitely. They're sort of hammering away at the door, aren't they? Saying, oh, hang on, I've got some more things to do. Got some more places I want to go and some more people I want to see. So yes, definitely. I hope that will be the case. Yes.
And I enjoy all of your books, but one of my very favorites is The Stranger Diaries.
Oh, I'm pleased. Thank you.
And I think we've talked about this before, but when I worked at Murder by the Book, it was such a huge hit there. And at one point we had a shelf that literally was just filled with that book, and they just sold like crazy because we were all recommending it.
Oh, I'm so glad. I do hope, and I do think that it maybe is a book that really appeals to booky people, isn't it? Because it's about a short story really that starts to come to life. And there are lots of sort of literary allusions and things like that. So Murder by the Book did amazingly with that book. But I think partly it was a book for booky people, a sort of love letter to booky people, really.
I think that's a great way to look at it, and probably why it did resonate so much. Even with this group of readers who read a wide range of things, we literally all read it and loved it, and that just didn't happen very often.
Oh, that's so great. And also, it was really wonderful to write a sort of Gothic book as well, a sort of I've always wanted to do that. As I was saying, I love Victorian literature, and this is modern day, but it is a bit Gothic, and it is about diary writing as well, and I write a diary. So all those things made it a lot of fun to write, quite challenging to write sometimes, but I was so delighted by how well it did in the States. Definitely my most successful book in the States, yes.
I can see that. Though, as I said, I love Ruth, and I think sometimes series, take a while and they're building, but it's just such a wonderful series, and I am sad it's done, but I totally get it. 15 books is a good amount.
Well, thank you. I think 15 books is a good amount. It feels like a good place to stop anyhow, and I do hope anyone who reads The Last Remains will feel satisfied with what I've done so far and feel it is a good place to stop. But as I say, I'm not. It's not like Conan Doyle and Sherlock Holmes falling off the Reichenbach Falls. I haven't done that. Spoiler alert, I haven't done that. So the doors are open possibly to more.
Yes. Well, before we wrap up, what have you read recently that you really liked?
And I've just read a book called Daisy Darker by a writer called Alice Feeney. She's British. I think this book did pretty well in the States as well. And I was talking earlier on about how I like to have all the characters marooned in a house in the middle of nowhere. So this is my perfect setup. So it's a family reunion in a house in Cornwall on the west coast there. And that house there's a causeway to the house that you can only get along at low tide. So when there's high tide, the house is totally cut off. And of course, this family, the Darker family, darker in more than one way, are in this house for a family reunion. And it's no spoiler to say there's a little bit of a then there were none going on. And the characters start disappearing one by one. And I absolutely loved it. I thought it was really well done. There's a really clever twist in it, which I didn't get at all. But I read it back to see how she'd done it, how Alice had done it. And she didn't cheat at all. But there's a brilliant twist in it. It's a very good story, a very, very memorable narrator. So that's called Daisy Darker. And I've also just read, actually, it's a proof. And it's called The Conspirators, and it's by a writer he's really William Shaw as a British crime writer, but this is writing, I think, as G.W. Shaw, and it's more of a thriller, and it's kind of almost was like a sort of old-fashioned thriller, and it's about a translator, who I think is a great hero for a conspiracy thriller. And it's about the drug trade in fertility drugs. And it's fascinating. Very, very good. So that's The Conspirators by G.W. Shaw.
That sounds really good. I love thrillers, especially ones, as you mentioned, that are kind of throwback thrillers. So I'm going to have to look that one up.
Well, William wrote a previous one that's called Dead Rich, again as G.W. Shaw. And it's set on one of those millionaire super yachts. And it's so good. Again, it's that kind of, old-fashioned thriller, but on this amazing setting. And all sort of opulence and all this like sinisterness of these super yachts. So that's a great one as well, if you like that sort of book. Dead Rich, that one's called.
Okay, good. Thank you so much. I always love learning about new authors. I'm not even familiar with him, so I'm going to have to go back and look him up.
Do look him up. He's great. It's another Brighton writer who's great. And Alice Feeney as well is great. And I'm quite pleased because actually I met Alice recently, only a couple of weekends ago, at a crime writing festival in Denmark. And she's great, lovely. Like a lot of these people who write dark books, she's a really lovely person. But I'm now reading through all her books. So I love discovering new people as well.
Yes, she's really big here.
Yeah. I think possibly bigger in the States than here. I'm not sure, but I think that might be right.
I have no idea how she is there, but I know I see every time she has a book out, people are posting a lot about it. And Daisy Darker, definitely there was a lot of publicity about it. Well, Elly, I love chatting with you, and I'm so happy you came back on the Thoughts from a Page podcast, and I can't wait for everybody to read The Last Remains. And if they're not familiar with Ruth, read the entire series.
Oh, thank you so much. Thanks for having me, Cindy. It's been great to be back.
Hi, I'm Christina Yerling-Biro, host of the podcast Pop Culture Confidential. Join me as I go way behind the scenes with some of the most influential people in entertainment and media. Hear actors such as Succession's Brian Cox talk about his favorite characters to play.
There always has to be a mystery. The audience have to be in a situation where they want to know what's going on.
Meet studio execs like Pixar chief Pete Docter and learn his secret on how he makes us cry.
Emotion is our first language.
And so many others who are defining popular culture, from Obama speechwriter David Litt to Top Chef host Padma Lakshmi.
We don't often think about food politically, or we don't want to, but it really is.
Join me. Search for Pop Culture Confidential wherever you get your podcasts.
Thank you so much for listening to my podcast. If you like this episode, and I hope you did, please follow me on Instagram at Thoughts From A Page. Consider joining my Patreon group to access bonus content and support the podcast. Tell all of your friends about the show and rate it or subscribe to it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I would really appreciate it. The book discussed in this episode can be purchased at my bookshop storefront, and the link is in the show notes. I hope you'll tune in next time.
Hi, I'm Christina Yerling-Biro, host of the podcast Pop Culture Confidential. Join me as I go way behind the scenes with some of the most influential people in entertainment and media. Hear actors such as Succession's Brian Cox talk about his favorite characters to play.
There always has to be a mystery. The audience have to be in a situation where they want to know what's going on.
Meet studio execs like Pixar chief Pete Docter and learn his secret on how he makes us cry.
Emotion is our first language.
And so many others who are defining popular culture, from Obama speechwriter David Litt to Top Chef host Padma Lakshmi.
We don't often think about food politically, or we don't want to, but it really is.
Join me. Search for Pop Culture Confidential wherever you get your podcasts.